Good morning. Just a quick background. I've been a radiation therapist for about 30 years, so I know this isn't a big radiation therapy group, but I think we have a lot of things in common and a lot of things we can share. When I was working on my doctorate, my research, I went into my research with this question of why do we do radiation therapy? Because that's the question everybody asks us. Oh my gosh, how can you do that? Or why do you do that? And so I thought I was going to have this big spiritual, existential kind of research project on why people chose radiation therapy. What I realized when I started doing my research was that the hard question wasn't why people did it. People knew why they went into healthcare. The hard question was how they did it. How do we keep doing those things over and over and over again? And it was a little difficult to get people to talk about it, but once they started talking about it, you realize that we have very common grounds on the things that make our jobs more difficult than they should be. So, like I said, that was my research, my doctoral research a few years ago, and that experience has kind of grown into how does all of this stuff that we do in clinic affect patient safety. So I'll refer to a bunch of radiation therapy. The computer's doing something. It's got like a McAfee security virus thing. I guess it's not showing it up there. I just don't want to crash on us again. Crazy thing. There we go.
We're good. Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
No problem. It's fine. Okay,
Great.
So there's a lot going on in clinic that doesn't need to be going on, and what this led to is how does that affect patient safety? Like I said, there's some radiation therapy accidents in here, mainly because those are the ones that make the news. Those are the big accidents. But I'm also going to talk about CT, MRI, radiography, some nuke med, because there's the potential for accidents in every one of our modalities. And very often, you'll see as we go through this, very often it goes back to the environment that you're working in. It goes back into the chaos or into the understaffing or lack of training or whatever. So we'll go through this. These are the objectives for this. Hope we meet them all. In 2002, a plane filled with school children left Moscow, Russia, headed to Spain. They were going on a field trip. They were doing a summer kind of study and all sort of thing. At the same time, a DHL cargo plane left Bahrain. They crashed over Berlin, Germany. 69 people on the school trip plane were killed, as well as the two pilots that were on the DHL plane. What they found, what happened is this was an overnight flight, and they only had 2 people working at the time, but because they had always done it this way, one of the guys was asleep. He'd gone to take a nap. Because the other guy could handle it, you'd always been able to handle it with one person. So they were down to one person. They had instituted a new safety policy and were putting in some new software that would throw out alerts to the planes, and nobody really knew how to use it. At the same time that the one air traffic controller was trying to talk to both planes, the telephone on the wall was ringing. He couldn't believe what he was doing to answer the call, and the call was from one of the planes trying to tell him, my safety features aren't matching what you're telling me to do. He was telling one of the planes to ascend, and the safety feature was telling it to descend. What happened is they crashed and everybody was killed. So when they did the root cause analysis on this airplane crash, the need for 2 people working at all times. So they had a backup, so that somebody could answer the phone. Timely dissemination of updated materials, and they had gotten this new safety system. They hadn't trained anybody on it. It was there, but nobody knew how it actually worked. Limit distractions, and by distractions, he was distracted by the phone, but he also had this other thing going on. There was a lot of chaos in that environment, and increased training when it came to those new policies they could put into place. And so what does this have to do with healthcare? This is where we learn almost everything that we follow the airline industry, because they're a whole lot better at it than we are, because they have a lot bigger accidents, and when they do, they put really good measures into place. In 2014, at a cancer center in Auckland, New Zealand, a patient that was being treated for bone mets from prostate cancer. So they were treating his spine. He had prostate cancer that had spread. They were treating his back. He received 3 times the amount of radiation that he was supposed to. And so to his spine, that had the potential for paralysis, had the potential for death even. But he received 3 times the amount of radiation that was the prescription. So what did they find when they looked at that? So this was reviewed by their national health system, and they found that the cancer center was understaffed. So let's think back to the airplane, and these were 2 people working there all the time. Understaffed and overworked, well, they just kind of describe it as chaos. So that's their national organization saying your working conditions are awful, and this is how this happened. Limit distractions and increase training. And so you can see the parallels between the airline accident and exactly what we're doing every day. In 2010, the New York Times had studied these different accidents, patient errors that had been occurring. And they ran, this is an incredible article if you want to just Google New York Times 2010 radiation therapy accident. They tracked 2 deaths. One of them was in Manhattan at St. Vincent's Hospital, and one was at a hospital called New York Downstate. And what happened with this accident right here, and I'll explain several things in this slide, like I said, especially since this is kind of radiation therapy. Mr. Jerome Parks was being treated for head and neck cancer. He was being treated right here. What happened is there was a machine malfunction and a lack of communication and distractions and not enough people working at one time and being overworked. What happened was the machine didn't work exactly like it was planned to work, like it's supposed to work, and they over-treated his spinal cord, and he died. Because when you treat for head and neck, you're supposed to block out the spinal cord because the tolerance dose is so low. He died from this treatment. So I want to focus on IMRT, and what that means is intensity modulated radiation therapy. This came about, 10, 15 years ago. It was the new way to do radiation therapy. So for example, used to, when we would treat head, neck, or prostate, or anything like that, the machine would just come in from laterals. There's 2 sides, just one side, 2 sides, 2 parallel opposed laterals. IMRT, once again, means intensity modulated radiation therapy. And the machine actually has leaves in it that move like this to make different shapes. And it moves. And so this was a huge, huge change in how we did everything. We were going from treating right left laterals, to the machine moving and turning and everything kind of being automated. And so what this says is that the state of New York had already told their departments, be ready for this. IMRT is hard, it takes more work, and it takes more people. So make sure you've got time for the significant time commitment and make sure that your staffing levels are where they're supposed to be. So the state of New York had issued some warnings, but it didn't stop this accident. Soon after the accident, and like I said, he was overdosed and died. Soon after the accident, once again, the state officials said, hey, be careful with those machines. A lot of radiation comes out of them. That's what the state said to them. Be careful, because you're dealing with some stuff that has the potential to be dangerous. Downstate, there was a woman being treated for breast cancer. So when you treat, you want everything to be as homogeneous as possible. So we use things called wedges. It looks like a wedge, fat on one end, skinny on the other end. So when you treat breast cancer, you put the wedge in so that it flattens all that out, so you don't have a big gap over there. This lady's been treated for breast cancer. They had the wedge flipped the wrong way, which means there was an overdose in the skinny part, an underdose in the fat part, and they literally burned a hole in her chest. And she also passed away. So what it says is one therapist mistakenly programmed the computer for the wedge in, wedge out backwards. Another therapist failed to catch the error, so you've got 2 people on there so far. And when physics did their chart checks, they missed it as well. So there's 3 people there, 3 different places this error could have been called. Even worse, they failed to notice during the treatment that it's displayed right there on the computer screen. It would have said wedge in, wedge out. And so they failed to notice that. Once again, the state had sent a notice saying, pay attention to what you're doing. And thank you, state. Thank you for telling us to pay attention to what we're doing. a story about when I was an early therapist. I worked at St. Jude in Memphis, and that was the best teaching experience of my entire life because our precision was unbelievable. So we moved. I went to a new hospital, and I was working with some new grads. And we actually were treating a lady for breast cancer, and she put the wedge in the machine, and the fault wouldn't clear. The lady was having 10 days of treatments. This was day 9. I was filling in on that machine because, whatever, I was filling in on that machine. She put the wedge in, the fault wouldn't clear. She put the wedge in, the fault wouldn't clear. She tried it a couple more times, and I said, wait a minute, I'm going to go outside and pull a computer plan and look at what the treatment plan is supposed to be. They treated that, because I knew that didn't make sense. They treated the lady wrong 9 days in a row because it's what they had always done. This is that New York Times article, and so they tracked data. Like I said, they published it in 2010, but they tracked data from 2001 to 2008. And in radiation therapy, they found 621 mistakes. 621 mistakes over 7 years. On 133 occasions, those things that used to modulate the field, like I said, those things that block the field, or wedges, or anything that's going to shape the radiation beam from coming out as just a direct square. 133 times, that just didn't happen. They didn't use them. On 284 times, it missed the body part that were supposed to be treated. 284 times. So it says one time they were going to implant some radioactive seeds, gold-98, they put radioactive seeds in the prostate that they missed and put it in the base of his penis. Another time a patient was treated for stomach cancer when it was supposed to be prostate cancer. Close, but not close enough. And 50 patients received radiation that was for another patient, for a whole other patient, including one that was supposed to be getting breast treatment. Nope, I got it back. One that was supposed to be getting brain treatment and instead got breast cancer treatment. So 50 patients got somebody else's radiation. So when the New York Times finished this article, what did they find? Software flaws. Those things that wouldn't make the leaves move the way they were supposed to. Faulty programming. That was the wedge in, wedge out thing. Somebody had just put it in backwards.
May I ask a question?
You correct.
Okay, the example you just said, I think if some of those or most of them are more negligence than any of these four, how much of the mistakes is negligence?
We'll get there. Hang on, because that's the topic of this whole thing. So we'll get there. They found software flaws, some faulty programming, poor safety procedures. That was all those checks. Remember I told you there were like 3, 4, 5 people along the way that could have caught that. And then inadequate staffing and training. And I'm probably going to say that on every slide from here on out. Inadequate staffing and training, which means you're understaffed, because we all know what that's like. You're running around like crazy, you're understaffed. It's not the department's fault, it's not manager's fault. It usually ends up somewhere up here. And undertrained. We'll talk a lot about undertrained too, especially with as fast as things are moving right now. Are all of your people trained adequately on the new advances? In radiation therapy, they want the newest, biggest, fastest. For example, they just introduced the MRI Linacs. Therapists don't do MRI, but they just introduced the new MRI Linacs. So we're expected to figure all that out with, with some training. One part of that report said all that the therapist had to do, the thing that made this all they had to do was watch the computer screen. It showed that the collimator was open. So this was on Mr. Jerome Parks when it was supposed to block out the spinal cord, but it didn't. And they went right through the spinal cord, paralyzed him, and he died. This is an actual picture from a clinic that I took back in the summer. All they had to do was watch the computer screen. How many computer screens right there? A bunch. One's for the machine, one's for the patient, one's for the treatment plan, one's to watch the machine rotate, one's to watch the treatment plan move, one's to watch those leaves move. But the findings said all they had to do was watch the screen. If you just looked down, you'd have known what was going on. But they were not watching the screen. In fact, the hospital didn't even tell them they had to. In their policies and procedures, they didn't nowhere in there that it said you need to watch the screen. What they were doing was Mr. Jerome Parks was sick. They were afraid he was going to throw up inside of that mask that they wear. They were watching their patient. They were watching one of the screens that has the patient on it, not the screen that showed the leaks to him. But all they had to do was look down. That's what the safety report said. In 2009, the Pennsylvania Patient Safety Authority looked at X-ray, and they found 652 events in X-ray. 50% were the wrong procedure or test, 30% were the wrong patient, 15% were the wrong side, 5% were the wrong site. So half the time they did the wrong thing, just did the wrong thing. A third of the time they did the wrong thing on the wrong person. Here you can see it broken down by modality. This is that study out of Pennsylvania, 2009, 652 events in 1 year. You see it broken down by modality. X-ray, unfortunately, is the most, almost half of that. CT, because these are 2009 stats, I'm sure they look a little different now. CT may be a little more heavily weighted. CT, they look at mammo, MRI, ultrasound. I'm not an ultrasound tech. I know some ultrasound folks. I'm not sure what ultrasound is doing, but they have more wrong patients and wrong procedures than lots of those other modalities. New med, interventional, PET. So this was a while ago because there's hardly anything up there about PET. Here it is this is a little more concise. So almost half the time it was X-ray, 18% was CT, mammo, MRI, and sonography. So that was 652 events in 1 year. And like I said, that's everything from the wrong patient to the wrong procedure or to the wrong side. So what they say, when they looked at these 652 events, what did the state of Pennsylvania say? They said they didn't have enough resources. They did not dedicate the resources to their departments and to their staffs to ensure patient safety. And that includes a shortage of fully prepared people. So remember I talked about when I said I was working with new grads and they just kind of assumed things were what they were supposed to be. So you have a shortage of fully prepared people. A shortage of space in which to create a calm environment. So I know lots of radiation therapy, we're always in the basement unless they built us a new cancer center somewhere. X-ray is always down a back hall or down, somewhere. You don't have the environment in which you can work calmly and safely and think about what you're doing. And then there's a shortage of dollars, not just for upgrades of equipment, because they're always trying to upgrade equipment and bring in something fancy, but a shortage of dollars for additional staff. So that goes back to that understaffed and undertrained. They also found that their systems, their procedures, their policies just didn't make sense. And what the report says is that there are 150 different points just to get a chest x-ray. So they went from the patient seeing the primary care physician who's got a referral or maybe order at that point or seeing somebody else. But they said there were 150 different points from beginning until that report was sent back to the physician that ordered it. That's 150 places that something could go wrong. And that's a chest x-ray. 150 different steps. And then the state of Pennsylvania said the work environment was a mess. It's busy, it's noisy, it's full of interruptions, and a lot of working environments are not designed for all of the things that we have to do today. They're not designed for the speed, they're not designed for communication, they're not designed for collaboration between departments. The lack of experienced staff means that they're not role models, preceptors, or mentors that are needed. And so if you have facilities that are in the habit of hiring a bunch of new grads because they're cheaper, you don't have the people above them to train them adequately to serve as preceptors, to serve as mentors. Not saying all of your seasoned staff is exactly the same way, but you do have that gap there, and you have to think about the people who may have been doing this a while, the people who are new at it, but if they're in that understaffed, overworked, busy, they may not have the patience to be a preceptor or a mentor. So we're not passing down to our generations the different training that we may need to. Whether that's affective or technical, we may not just don't have the time or, motivation to do so. So just a couple of years ago in the UK, they looked at MRI safety events. They looked at about 1.3 million patients. They came up with about 4,500 MRI related events. And this was mainly at hospital-based sites. They said there were some issues at mobile units, about a third of them were mobile units, but most of the issues came from hospital-based sites. So here's an example, and they said it was a near miss that occurred when a patient came in with a pacemaker, and they didn't know, had an implanted device, and they didn't know that the patient had a pacemaker. They called it at the last minute and were able to remove the patient safely. But why did that happen? And what they said, when they did the report in the UK, said it was poor communication within that team that was taking care of that patient. And they cited that there were too many people involved in patient care, whether it's physicians or nurses or MAs or whoever else is working, in the MRI suite, that it was too many patients, too many people working on it, and it just kind of caused confusion. So it's confusion. That's the first one. And then this was another event. It was a heat-related incident, and so the patient got a small burn, but because they were wearing a sweater that had like metallic threads in it, a shiny sweater. And then another kind of burn, heat-related incident was when a patient put their hands together. They moved their hands and made a conductive loop during the MRI scan, during the MRI. And so what did they find out about that? Ineffective tech and patient education. So the technologist should have known not to let the patient wear the metallic sweater, but the patient should have been told that so both parties there, and inappropriate patient preparation and positioning. So that's another, that was just an education thing. Was it the technologist that didn't say to the patient, hey, keep your hands still, don't hold your hands, don't move your hands? That's education on both parts. It's the tech not relaying that to their patient, and it's the patient not knowing, having not been told that. So even though MRI is really low and not near as catastrophic as maybe therapy or even X-ray, when something does happen, it's a series of failings, and this goes to your question. It's either a process failure or it's a human error. Usually, it's not systems as much as it's the things that are operating within the system. So they take these MRI incidents back to process failure and then to human error, and both of those are preventable. On the MRI, they said about a third of them were contraindicated referrals, meaning that somebody got referred for an MRI that shouldn't have been there, like the person with the pacemaker, somebody that had an implantable device. Contrast, inability to confirm patient safety. There's some implants in foreign bodies, projectiles, and then the burning and heat-related issues that are really low on there. But that's kind of the breakdown of what the MRI errors look like. I just want to run around the room. There's so much to turn people. So they picked two of those categories and said the one that says unable to confirm your patient safety, and then that unexpected implant or foreign body, about a quarter of those. And they said that's associated with communication. And so that's what we were talking about. So maybe it's the ordering doctor that ordered an MRI, but the patient had a pacemaker, but he didn't make that connection, so he ordered it anyway. Or somebody came in a shiny sweater. So that's about communication and interaction with your patients, whether that's from the within the MRI suite with the nurse that's seeing the patient beforehand, or even with the ordering doctor. That's all about communication. And then they also talk about busy departments, which lead to weaknesses and in your patient screening processes. And this is just because you're busy, and I don't want to say you skip things, but you skip things. You want to get to the end point. You want to take care of your patient because you got another patient coming. So you want to get this one taken care of. And if it was missed on one of those other 150 steps before you got here, if you're not the last person to catch it, then it goes through. So their kind of concise reported findings said it was a misunderstanding of organizational safety policies. Busy departments or schedules, ineffective communication, and inappropriate safety training. So are you seeing a pattern? Yeah. lack of training, busy, lack of communication, chaos. Okay, so now we'll pick up NUMED. So in 2005 in Scotland, they found 606 incidences in nuclear medicine, 85%. That top line says they also looked at radiology as well. 37% in NUMED, 80% were human error or procedure failure. So once again, it's not the machine, it's not the software that can't contribute, but 80% of the time it's human error. Other incidences, and we'll talk about some NUMED stuff. Also NUMED, in Australia in 2017, they found that there were errors either in the preparation, like in the hot lab, when they're preparing the doses, or while they're doing the actual scans and actual studies on patients. And they said it was interruptions, busy work environments, and once again, deficient systems or processes. I found these stats to be shocking, but not surprising. I think it's one of those things, like I said at the very beginning, people don't really want to talk about this stuff, but when they start talking about this stuff, they're like, oh my gosh, you wouldn't believe all the stuff that's going on. They're like, yeah, at this point, I believe almost anything. So they said NUMED technologists are interrupted as a whole, major interruptions, 4.5 times an hour. Every 15 minutes, somebody's talking to you about something that's not about the patient, that you're not doing. The highest interruption rate was when they were in between rooms. Maybe they're going from the hot lab to one camera, maybe they're going from one camera to another camera. And that was over 10 times an hour. So that means you leave the hot lab, you walk into your scan room, and somebody stops you. So what goes on in your brain at that point? What goes on in your head at that point? If you've got about 10,000 things going on right there, but you were thinking about something here, you were headed to take care of your patient, and you got interrupted 10 times an hour. 10 times an hour. And it said interruptions like inside the hot lab were still at like 4.5 times an hour. I don't know how NUMED gets anything done. It's only being interrupted. I'm from Tennessee, and so this took place an hour and a half from my house. My daughter's also a nurse practitioner, so I called her as soon as this happened, and I was like, but what else was going on? So I don't know if you know the story. It's about a year old. A nurse sent a patient down for MRI. They were to give her a sedative, but instead gave her anesthetic that paralyzed. They usually use it for intubation, so they paralyzed the patient. She died down in MRI, actually. Prosecutors, and this lady was prosecuted. The nurse went to court. It was a big deal. Prosecutors said there were at least 10 mistakes, 10 different points along the way that she could have made a different decision. Some of them were safety errors. Some of them were not being able to spell. 10 different mistakes that led to this nurse accidentally giving this patient a fatal dose of the paralytic. She told investigators that she was distracted. And that's what your environments look like, distraction. And this is a little difficult to see, but for 78% of the time, medication errors, nurses say that they're too rushed or they're working in a busy environment. She said she was distracted 10 different steps along the way before she gave the patient the dose of the paralytic. This is actually from my own research, and one of my therapists said 12 hours is a lot. So we're talking about a therapist working a 12-hour shift. I'm up and going, and I'm not tired. Physically, I'm not tired. I can keep taking care of my patients. But I think the whole mental stress and what goes through a therapist's head all day long and on all the patients, and the number just keeps getting bigger. So think about, we talk about NUMED, think about all the stuff that's in your head. For a therapist, it's who's the next patient, what's this patient doing, what's the dose, has there been any change, has the doctor ordered anything new, who's supposed to see the doctor today, whose nurse day is it, are we shrinking this field any? Oh, and because we talk to our patients all the time, whose grandkids are coming for a visit, whose birthday is it, what are you doing this weekend, who brought you cookies that morning? There's so much stuff going on in our heads. And that's what this therapist said. Physically, I can do it. Mentally, I can't keep up after 12 hours. And another one of my therapists said, I'm thinking 100 times over because I'm the only one standing between me and a mistake. We are the last button pushers. So after all the doctors and all the physics and all the centers, when it comes down to it, we're the ones that are going to turn the machine on. So for therapy, that's a lot of radiation. For X-ray, it still counts. For CT, it still counts. MRI, lead med, your staff is the last person standing between you and that patient, between a mistake and treatment patient safely. I work on a committee called the Radiation Oncology Safety Stakeholders Initiative. And so it's a group that's radiation therapists, vendors, doctors, physicists, dosimetrists. It's a bunch of people. And there was a survey done about 3 years ago. And what they were asking, they asked therapists what they thought had the biggest potential for a mistake. And interestingly enough, they were looking for software and hardware answers. What they didn't expect were these kinds of answers. And so this is just one of the qualitative answers, and it says that therapists are being asked to perform under unsafe conditions. And so what does unsafe mean to them? Too little staffing, too complex, because like I said, everything's getting harder and harder and harder, busier, all the while being distracted. And even the therapist said this has the potential for a patient error. If we keep working in these conditions, then there's the potential for a patient error. Constant pressure for throughput with complex procedures, frank non-support from management. So how many of you are just getting busier, needing to do more and more of our patients? And we're all in the same place. If you keep getting busier and busier, working with the same number of people, the same types of people, the same educated people, the same trained types of people, but you're supposed to be productive. So this is the productivity over patients model. And they believe, this therapist believed, that there was no support from their management in this type of situation. We've talked about training quite a bit, but it came out in this survey as well, that employees are not trained to do what they need to do. So, and y'all can help me with some of the other modalities. In therapy, if we get a new piece of equipment, they send somebody out to Varian in Vegas or Siemens or whatever. They train a super user, and that super user comes back to the department and is supposed to take care of everybody else, right? Well, to me, that kind of sounds like the telephone game that you played when you were a little kid and you whisper something to somebody, and by the time it gets shared, I mean, you're putting a lot of pressure and a lot of faith on that super user. So what this says is, you're giving us all these tools, and thank you for the tools, but please let us know how to use them. Another thing that I heard when I was doing my own research was that the hospital, the facility, would sign a contract with the vendor, and in it, it included, X number of hours for increased training, X number of hours for, them to come into the department and show you what was going on. But what they said was they never got it. They didn't have time for the training. They promised us training, but we're too busy pushing patients through to actually get that training.
That's what I was going to say. I'm a vendor back. I work for a hospital. That most vendors, say all the two vendors, they provide detailed training to the user in addition to selecting one on site with their patients. And that's what they prefer. And then they on site, and then they select maybe one or two depending on the team, and the super user to be able to do a little bit more manipulation of the system. But all the users, I'll give you an example. Like last week, we had one vendor to come and they really didn't need training, but the vendor wanted 2 days of full training. So management sent the people to the training, or they're too busy they can't. So this person came from the vendor, and then for 2 days did nothing. And here goes our 2 days of training that we provided. So I don't know if we're going to cover that, but my whole thing is that I'm a service engineer. I'm not a management or anything like that. But I see a lot of problem with management. Excuse all managers too. But to me, the management don't understand the real world environment, as you're saying. Staffing, the throughput, and everything. I'll give you a great example. Many years ago, we went from the analog manufacturing machine to digital manufacturing machine. The places that they had the management was, they thought in their dream that one digital could replace 2 analog machines. So that means now they have to have a throughput of 6 to 8 patients per hour.
Right.
There's no way they could do 6 to 8 patients an hour.
Right.
Especially when the ladies come, I fix the machine, I don't do the microphone. But the ladies come, they're nervous. Yeah, some of them are old, they cannot walk, they need wheelchair, and all the technologies coded to the visit to have to do something with the machine. They complain to me, we are stressed out. In one day, last year, out of 45 nanotech, 25 of them called in sick. Either stress or sick or for a reason that just didn't want to.
Sick stress. So he brings up a good point. I don't know how things in radiology are scheduled in radiation therapy. You know, we've got 10-minute time blocks, 15-minute time blocks, 10-minute or 20-minute time blocks. And to your point, not every patient is equal. If all things were equal, you could do a patient every 10 minutes or every 15 minutes or 18 minutes or whatever. But that doesn't take into account the wheelchair-bound patient or the patient that needs help changing clothes, or the patient that just wants to sit and talk to you for a minute. You know, as providers, we're on that front line as well. We're the ones that are supposed to be gaining this information from our patients, helping our patients, caring for our patients, getting our patients through this time. But that doesn't always fit in that 10-minute time slot. It doesn't always fit. So in 2010, some of the powers that be decided, hang on a minute, let's have a safety summit. Let's see it was on the heels of that New York Times article. A lot of things happened in 2010. It was on the heels of that New York Times article. And so ASTRO, which is our doctor organization, our radiation therapy doctor organization, ASTRO got together with the AAPM, which are physicists, and they're like, what's going on? How did these accidents in New York happen? What really happened there in New York? And how can we improve going forward? And so they have a big safety summit, improving patient safety in radiation oncology. And the first thing they looked at, staffing levels. Then they did some analysis of different processes, error reporting, accreditation, standardizing procedures, and then checklists. So they came up with this big idea, we'll go into this here in a minute, but they came up with this big idea that before you treat a patient, you need a checklist. So you had these, extra 10, 15, 20 different things. Have you got the right patients, the right, right side, the right procedure, the right whatever. Well, which is a great idea. You absolutely should be doing that. But what it came down to is people were like, it was just one more thing for them to have to do. It was one more thing that was standing in between them finishing that patient and getting done to that patient or doing whatever. That it just became kind of another rote. They just did it because they had to do it, sort of thing. At the same time, the ASRT, so this is an article, a white paper from the ASRT in 2012. They did radiation therapy safety, and what's the role of a radiation therapist. And what they look at, staffing levels, training and credentialing, error reporting, accreditation, and those checklists and timeouts. So everybody's looking at staffing levels. ASTRO has said in radiation therapy, you need 2 patients on every machine. Do you know how many people still treat alone? And what are the implications? What are the consequences of somebody having to make all of those decisions on their own with the chaos and the phone ringing and the interruptions? This is an incredible teaching tool. ASTRO did it in 2012, and they just updated it last year. The title of the white paper is called "Safety is No Accident." Safety is no accident. You have to be conscious about what you're doing. You have to be conscious. It's not an accident to be safe. Once again, with the checklist, adequate time. Like I said, those 10-minute time slots don't work for everybody. So adequate time of training, credentialing, error reporting, and accreditation. In the 2019 update, and I know this is a lot of words, but it's just a quote from the article, and it says, radiation therapy is complex and it's rapidly evolving, and I assume that is for all of the modalities. Things are they're harder than they were 10 years ago. They're harder than they were 20 years ago. But it said that it's got to be a coordinated effort by all of the different people in there. Think of all the different people that are in your department. You cannot have inefficient systems because they lead to frustration, rushing, cutting corners. And you don't mean to cut corners. You don't want to cut corners. You're not cutting corners to not be safe. You're cutting corners just because you're in a hurry. You're in a hurry. Cutting corners. And all of these things need to work together so that you have a safe environment and that your clinical workflow is effective. Does everybody in your department feel safe to raise concerns to management about what's going on? They should, do they? Like I said, when I very first started my original research, it was like nobody wanted to talk about it until they all started talking about it. They should feel safe. Who knows somebody that's been fired because they made an error? Yeah, I do too. I know somebody that was let go. Well, it was 2 therapists working on the machine, and one of them got fired. So who knows what's going on? These are the same things that are going on in people's head all the time. What if I make a mistake? And if I make a mistake, am I supposed to tell anybody I make a mistake? Do you think all errors get reported? It is often the frontline staff that are more likely to understand the limitations of current procedures and propose those improvements. And that's what you said. People on the front line, do you believe that frontline staff has a better handle about what's going on in the department than this guy up here? So I have a story for you. I was having dinner, I was not having dinner. I was having lunch with the CEO of a hospital. And we were talking about, the research and patient safety and workplace conditions and their potential for patient error. And I'm describing all this to him, and I'm talking to him about it, CEO of a hospital. And he said to me, I have ancillary staff that deals with that. I don't really have anything to do with it, but we did just get great new artwork in the atrium. You want to go see it? So this goes, once again, to your point, frontline staff knows what's going on. Frontline staff sees the problems. Frontline staff could probably propose an improvement, but this guy's busy showing you his new artwork he just got in the atrium. In a safety-minded culture, all staff are encouraged or suggest. So I asked, do you think that people feel safe to make improvements, to call things out, to suggest things, or do you think people are afraid? So if you go back to the ROSI, the group I said I was a part of, that safety stakeholders initiative group, on that survey, one of the questions was about error reporting. There are error reporting systems in radiation therapy where we're supposed to report the errors. There are different levels. There are near misses. There are catastrophic sentinel events. So they go the full gamut. We're supposed to report them. 50% of radiation therapists said, I'm not saying a word to anybody because I'm afraid that it'll cost me my job. The other 50% said, I'll use it, but you have to guarantee me that there's no punitive damage. 50% said, I ain't telling you nothing. And the other 50% said, I'll only use it if you promise me it's not going to hurt me. It's not going to cost me. How'd we get here? Oh, we've probably always been here. We're just now talking about it. Things have changed really quickly, even over the past decade. So remember I told you in 2010 they started IMRT with all the moving leaves and jaws. That's old now. That's a decade old now. We're on the proton therapy and heavy ion therapy, flash therapy, where they're saying a patient can get treated in just a few seconds. But there are only about 2 people on Earth that I've let give me that kind of dose of radiation over about 2 seconds. Well, what kind of trust do you have? I'd be scared to death. I'd be scared to death as a therapist. I'd be scared to death as a therapist to deliver an entire course of radiation in just a couple of seconds. Automation, reliance on computers. That kind of goes back to that web story I told you earlier, where I thought it through, the new grad didn't. We've gotten very reliant on computers. Not a bad thing until it takes away your ability to think about what you're doing. Demands on staff, that's what this whole talk's been about. Demands on staff, time, emotional, mental, the things you talk about. How many people are doing jobs that aren't really radiology? How many people do some nursing stuff, some triage stuff, some answering the phone stuff, some other kind of stuff? There are tons of demands on staff right now. And then in complexity, and so for radiation therapy, things are hard. Some things are really, really hard right now. And so everything changed, and we had a culture shift, a shift to how can we get this done and still take care of our patients? And management, you're not making it real easy on us. You're making it very difficult for us to be able to work in these environments. So the AAPM, like I said, that's the American Association of Physicists in Medicine. They always task group that study stuff. Coincidentally, task group 100 was to study radiation therapy because they wanted to look at patient safety. And once again, they thought they were going to find a lot of stuff in hardware and software, and that's not what they found at all. Errors that are due to failures in device. Errors occur not because of software and hardware, but rather because of workflow and processes. So most of the time, your machines are going to work the way they're supposed to work. Most of the time, your machine, there could be some errors, but most of the time, your machines are going to work the way they work. What's not going to work? Where's the breakdown going to be? And it's going to be in that 150 steps of a chest X-ray. It's going to be in that miscommunication. It's going to be in that distance of the 10-minute time slot. It's going to be in the, you know, they just added a new patient on. They cited lack of standardized procedures, lack of communication, inadequate training, human failure, human failure, human failure. We'll go into those on the next slide. And a lack of staff, whether that means that you're just too rushed and you don't have enough people in there, a lack of time to get done what you need to do, or fatigue. You're just worn out, whether it's physical or mental or emotional, you're just worn out. Okay, so let's think back to that IMRT treatment. The AAPM wanted to see, remember we had 150 steps on a chest X-ray. This process map is about a quarter of the entire tree for IMRT. I don't look at this, we can't read it. What I want you to note is all of the times that are green, that's one of those points where they say it could be a catastrophic error. So look how many different times as you're going across there that there's some green words. And they said that every one of these points could be a catastrophic error. So what did the airline industry do? What did they do to fix some of their issues? So we all flew in here, I suppose. What happens when a plane lands and it's sitting there and you're out at the gate and they're calling you by zones or whatever, it's sheer chaos? That's something they can work on, I'm just gonna be honest with you, that boarding, loading. What happens in this space right here? So I live in Chattanooga, I connected Atlanta, period. I fly from Chattanooga to Atlanta, Atlanta to all over the world. My flight from Chattanooga to Atlanta is 18 minutes long. 18 minutes. I'm in the air, 18 minutes. For them to plan on this space right here, they start working almost 2.5 hours before you hit the ground. 2.5 hours is what this process takes for an 18-minute flight. So the airline industry realized that if things went according to plan here, they wouldn't have some of their other issues. And here's a piece of their process map of what takes place on the ground. Think of all the stuff that's going on. So like I said, 2.5 hours are starting waiting for your plane to come in. Then they've got all those people on the ground who are parking you, cleaning the plane, changing out the food, getting the fresh coffee, putting gas in the plane, hoping to find in your bag and it's making it to the next destination. They adopted a policy called one team, one term. One team, one term. And that means that anybody that had anything to do with that flight were dedicated to the sole purpose of getting that plane turned around. And when they adopted that, it eliminated a lot of the chaos, miscommunication, not enough time. They studied it enough to see how much time does it take to actually make this successful. One team, one term. So when the ASRT, let's keep the one team, one term going on here because we need the overwork guy all the way down to frontline staff. We need one team in our departments. So when the Astro did a failure analysis on that big tree that I showed you, their number one cause for failure was human failure, 230 times. There's also lack of training, lack of communication, a little bit of hardware software. Like I said, most of the time you're supposed to work the way it's supposed to work. Lack of staff, and a little bit more equipment and everything. Human failure. What is human failure? Loss of attention, biased expectations, distractions, bad judgment in the face of deviation from the normal process, fatigue, and overwork. So the bad judgment. Things are going crazy. You got a patient supposed to be in a 10-minute time slot. Obviously going to take 25 minutes. It's going to throw everybody else off. The doctor just called and said, oh my gosh, we've got to add a new patient on. What does bad judgment mean? I think most of the time it means you made the best decision that you could at that time. Lack of training is bad judgment. So these are the human failures that they attributed, to those 230 different causes. Once again, this was just this is more for impact than for you to, I can't even read that. They took the steps that had the highest rank for error. Which ones of those things caused, not always, which one of those things more often ended in an error? 6 out of the top 10. 6 out of the top 10 had to do with lack of training. In some cases, and once again, we're talking about radiation therapists moving between different kinds of machines. It means you know what you're doing over here. This is what you always do. This is the machine you're always working on. But if they pull you and put you over here, do you know what's going on over there? No, not always. And I think the same can be said for any modality. If you're used to doing what you're always doing, are you adequately trained to be pulled and put somewhere else to work on a different piece of equipment, to do a different procedure, whatever that may be? 6 out of 10 times they cited lack of training. It says there are new technologies with few training opportunities. And you made the perfect point about that just a few minutes earlier, where you said that you had a vendor on site, but that management wasn't willing to give the time for their people to be trained. Practices must ensure that everybody's qualified. So short staffing is kind of like drunk driving. Usually everything goes okay, but all the time somebody's life is at risk. And we're in the exact same position. For the most part, it's going to go okay, but it doesn't mean that you can diminish how important your job is, how important that there's a patient, and oftentimes you're the last thing standing between the patient and an error. So the AAPM concluded that we needed to standardize procedures, that we needed to train our staff, that we needed to communicate, make sure our hardware and software is working, and that we need to commit to adequate staff and physical resources. That goes back to that money thing. Are there enough dollars there to make sure that your environment's the way it should be? that your machinery is working the way it should, and that you have enough people to do the job. So what does a culture of safety mean? So once again, the state of New York sat down several times and said, be careful, watch this, do that. Those machines put out a lot of radiation. But did they really adopt a culture of safety? Does the CEO who's looking at his artwork, does he embrace, is he a proponent of, does he even have any idea what I'm talking about when we talk about a culture of safety? Some of that is we have to acknowledge that we're in a high risk business. We're in high risk business, not just because of the radiation, but because we're taking care of patients. So that acknowledgement has to come from the top down. Our big one CEO has got to realize that he's got people that are making really, really crucial decisions. It's got to be a blame-free environment. So back to the reporting mechanism, where 50% of the therapists said, I ain't telling you. I'm not telling you. It's got to be blame-free. They were afraid they were going to lose their jobs. Collaboration across ranks. Can you go to your doctors and say, hey, this isn't working? Can you go to management and say, this isn't working? But I've got another idea, or I've got a different idea, or let's work together on an idea. And then organizational commitment of resources. Your organization can't say, I know you've got 10 people on staff, but we would do, our numbers would look so much better if we only had 8. But keep doing the same amount of patients. It's got to be an organizational commitment. Safety and quality are sometimes separate. You're like, I'm working. Oh wait, hang on, I've got to do some safety. I'm working, but they've got to go together. It's just got to be part of the fabric of the department, whether that is X-ray or CT or equipment. It's got to be part of the fabric. This just says that leadership has to give that opportunity to staff. Back to the productivity over patients model. That can't be the model that's most effective. Leadership has to provide training, has to provide adequate staffing, has to provide the time, has to provide the things that the staff need. As you can tell, Royals is the radiation oncology incident learning system. And so when I was talking about those reporting mechanisms, this is where we keep all of that. That's what you can go read it. You can look this up too. There's some pretty good stories in there. This is where 50% of the people said, I'm not telling you anything. I am not telling you anything. And the other 50% said, I'll tell you, but it can't cost me my job. This is a national database. It holds all of the radiation therapy errors or near misses. But when it was set up, the intent was to develop a culture of safety where you can talk about things so you can use them as learning incidences. This says it's got to be a culture of learning where you should change the questions from not who did it, not pointing fingers at people, but what happened and how do we fix it going forward. Not blame the person and that person be afraid they're going to get fired. Not that that shouldn't be done sometimes, but what happened and how do we prevent it? And then a culture of justice, where you hold everybody accountable, but everybody's accountable. All the blame is not put off on one person. So, some questions about your own departments. Within this definition of culture, how does leadership characterize the culture of your department? So do you believe that you're in a supportive department across the board? Do you have a safe culture, and does the leadership of your organization support that? How would frontline staff characterize the culture? Is there a disconnect there? Does admin think they're doing one thing and frontline staff think something else is going on? Is there a disconnect in what they believe that culture of safety is? And how well does your organization as a whole understand this stuff? And is it passed down through all the different levels of the organization? The RSNA says that a fair and just culture improves patient safety because it empowers the employees not only to make suggestions, but to recognize their importance in all the steps that are going on. So if you allow frontline staff, or if you allow engineering, or if you allow the people that are helping out whether that's, like I said, MAs or something like that, if you allow them to have a voice in all of this, and you collaborate to bring up a safe environment. A shared model of accountability, you've got to learn from your mistakes, not blame individuals. So this is for admin. Learn from your mistakes, not blame individuals. Behavioral choices, you've got to design safety into all your processes. And most importantly, it's got to be a commitment from the entire organization. They have to know that safety is a thing. Maybe, you know, I wonder how many of the people that are putting spreadsheets together, the people that are telling you you just did 25 patients a day, do they even realize that safety is a thing until it's too late? Until it's too late. RSNA says they have a formal learning process that identifies safety and quality gaps, that they're strengthening their culture by bringing their people together and encouraging them to be a part of this process. They're bringing their people together by encouraging them. They said they're telling stories of human excellence that occur each day. So what the point of this was, and this one was in Indianapolis, the Indiana University. Their point was, if we can focus on all the good stuff that's happening, then maybe we don't get down that rabbit hole of the overworked and chaos and lack of communication. This is that same thing. They said they wanted a healthy environment with a healthy mindset, and they thought that that these conversations would help make that stronger. That their faculty, their staff would feel like they were in a much healthier environment if they just talked about some of the things and they accepted them and they looked at them for ways to change. So what are some? Let me know if any of your facilities have some of these things. On-site massage services, gym memberships, a wellness program, photography, yoga, and then stress relief courses. I talked to a cancer center director one day, and she was telling me, oh, we've got this quiet room, it's on the second floor, peaceful music, it's like a spa. Sometimes we have shoulder massages, you can come up here and just, you know, rest, peace, drink tea. But she said, the therapists don't get to come up here very often because they're always working. And as a note, these classes designed to reduce stress and encourage work-life balance don't usually work very well either. So what's it really going to take? This article said there was a notable lack of workplace stress management strategies. So admin didn't really do anything about it. The participants, the frontline staff, the folks that are actually on the ground, took that to mean that management had a lack of interest in what was going on. So management's not really thinking about it. They're thinking about numbers, which is all okay because that's how we get paid. We get paid based on numbers. But they're not thinking about what's going on down here. And the frontline staff says, you don't care what I'm doing. And so there's a huge disconnect between those two. So be nice to your people. Encourage them more. We reward their staff, is what they found worked some, and to provide them with further and continuous education, which is not just in that increased training, but even with professional development. Even, coming to a conference like this, these are not opportunities that everybody has. Some people are just stuck where they are, and they feel that burden because they feel like management is taking care of them. Management's not giving them all the tools they need to do the best job that they can. You can we go back?
Yeah, let's listen to your slides. Slides ones you went through. I'll go back to that down here. They're all about fixing staff, fixing operators. But it's not fixing the problem.
No, it's not, and that's the point. It's not fixing the problem. It's not eliminating, all of the, we'll go back to the New York Times article. They'd sent out the warnings, be careful, pay attention, watch what you're doing. But when you came back to the root cause for every one of those, the root cause was the same. Lack of staff, lack of training, overwork, productivity. So no, these don't fix it. The on-site massage service doesn't fix it because why? Nobody gets to go. They're too busy going. Yeah. So that's, which was kind of the point of what they said. This was part of that one article. And what they said, you've got to get to the point where you're actually talking to people, collaborating with people, encouraging, it said encouraging and morally rewarding people. You've got to make them part of the conversation. That's where there's often so much of a disconnect. Once again, back to therapists, because that's what I know the best. They feel like they're working in a bubble. It would be the same, in my opinion, would be the same thing for CT or MR or X-ray or whatever. You're the person that's right there with the patient. You're the person that's doing the most important work, but you've got somebody else making the decisions for you. Right. So back to what I said originally, a lot of people don't want to talk about it until you start talking about it. And then if you start talking about it, somebody's like, yeah, this is what's going on at my facility, and this is what's going on at my facility. And how do we, the incident learning system was supposed to help radiation therapists so that we could track errors, we could track how things happen, we could track whether it was hardware or software. But what it keeps coming back to is it's not hardware, it's not software, it's how you're making us do the things that we're supposed to be doing and not giving us the resources that we need, whether those are just emotional resources or mental resources or training resources. We're not being provided with the resources that we need. Yeah.
Instead, some of the risk managers actually help the patient instead of stop complaining or else.
Stop complaining or else, or there's the, I don't want to keep using the word disconnect, lack of communication, because the risk managers are looking at numbers, looking at the number of falls, looking at the number of readmits, looking at the number of whatever. Radiation's a hard risk to look at if you don't know what you're doing. If you haven't been in radiation, if you had, whether it's CT, MRI, therapy, if you don't know the risk of radiation, how can you manage the risk of something you can't see? How can you manage the risk of something you don't understand? If you're not on the front line all the time, if you have no idea what radiation is even doing, if you don't understand the importance of pushing that button, how can you manage that risk? Because I don't think they even have any concept of what we're doing. So often, if you're looking at accreditation, if you're looking at JAGO or any of those big ones, even CMS, if you're looking at Medicare, Medicaid, any of those CMS reimbursements, they're looking at what readmits, infections, falls in the hospital. Nobody looks at us until the New York Times does an article on it. Until MRI in the UK or Scotland or New Zealand or something like that happens. They're looking at some of those other measurables. I'm used to a clock. Does anybody have any time? Does anybody have any other questions? I want y'all to be here long enough to get your credit.
Yeah, I was going to say, just talk about the regulatory agency. I think sometimes the focus is shifted so much on one side that we forget about the actual business practice of the technologies.
Yeah.
They're so focused sometimes on the key point information of the patient, like you said, the records.
Right.
And actual what happens with the patient itself. And how safe it is for the patient when it walks in.
Well, and not to get off on another tangent, but I know Melody's going to talk about some of this stuff later. If you're looking at like a code, if you're coding things for billing or whatever, X code in radiation therapy gets paid the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. But it doesn't take into account the patient that can't stand up, the patient that needs extra care, the patient. There's so many, and so numbers people, CEO people, CFO people, they're looking at those codes, they're looking at what their reimbursement looks like. They're, you can pay the exact same amount on this code with so many other variables. And those are the things that aren't taken into account, all the other variables. But You saw the root causes of all of these. It's those variables that make the difference. It's those variables that not cause it, but those variables that added up to a lot of the accident. It's all of those other things that aren't always measurable. Anybody else have any questions? All righty, I think that's about it. Thank you.